Morning, everybody. We're starting now. Welcome to the fourth day of the Bergen Exchanges. Today's events will evolve around the topics transnational justice, land and indigenous rights, and child rights. I have the honor of introducing today's keynote speaker, Dr. Angana Chatterji. Dr. Chatterji is research anthropologist and founding co-chair of the Political Conflict, Gender and People's Rights Initiative at the Center for Race and Gender, University of California, Berkeley. She's also a research fellow at the Center for Human Rights and International Justice at Stanford University. The list of publications with Dr. Chatterji's name on it is truly impressive. Her most recent ones include Breaking Worlds, Religion, Law and Nationalism in Majoritarian India, The Story of Assam, and Majoritarian State, How Hindu Nationalism is Changing India. Dr. Chatterji is among the most recognized experts on Kashmir and has given testimony to international bodies and parliamentary committees in the US and Europe on several occasions. Her work to uncover and publish documentation of anonymous mass graves in Kashmir in 2009 was instrumental in raising the issue of the grave and systematic violations of human rights in Kashmir internationally. A work that was later extended by the High Commissioner for Human Rights in the first and only report on the human rights violation in Kashmir, produced by the UN. Dr. Chatterji's work is extremely important and inspiring, and I'm greatly looking forward to hearing her keynote of today with the title Counter Memory, States Erasure and the Law, Fragments from Kashmir. Angana, please, the stage is yours.
Hi, can you hear me? Perfect. Thank you so much. You're very kind in your introduction. I want to thank you for really making a practice of taking in strangers and making them friends. And I'm so grateful to the Center for Law and Transformation and to the fierce and beautiful Siri Glopin for inviting me and for having me here. You are truly a force of nature with an incredibly generous spirit and heart. Thank you. And also to the Rafter Foundation for Human Rights, yes, for years of solidarity with my colleagues in Kashmir and myself. I'm equally grateful. And to faculty and staff and students in your amazing institution. It's a pleasure to be here. So, yes, counter memory, states of erasure, and the law, fragments from Kashmir. Will you give me something when I have 5 minutes to go? Yes, and if I don't hear, just sort of, thank you. I remain hopeful that as we engage in this conversation today, we are reminded of the ethical and practical responsibilities that inhere as scholars, practitioners, and readers, as subjects of, in the global South and North, of those with complex relations to race, class, nation, immigration, gender, sexuality, and culture. Mindful that our own understandings reflect our situatedness and are always partial and perspectival. How may we bear witness to post-colonial, decolonial conditions of grief, dispossession, agency in affective solidarity? How can our differing positionalities and experiences constitute relevant entry points to understanding the entanglements of colonial history, neocolonial realpolitik, and the post-colonial, always with a slash, majoritarian state? The role and use of colonial criminal law in the production of iniquitous states in South Asia and contemporary use of absolute nationalism by the majoritarian elite in India for the production of illiberal democracy and a caste-oppressed and minoritized nation is beginning to pose a structural challenge for the survival of the state itself. The Indian state was configured along the colonial and feudal fault lines of religion, ethnos, and identity at the intersections of the individual, the local, and the state and extra-state, formative of official history and practice, law and order, secularity and tolerance versus entitlements. Decades of political conflict, radical inequities, and repressive governance led to the consolidation of power by the Hindu right in 2014. Since the 2019 re-election of the Hindu nationalist Bharatiya Janata Party-led government, physical and organized attacks, lynching, abuse, and deep systemic discrimination have made India's Muslims, numbering over 180 million, one of the most vulnerable populations in the world anywhere. Casteist, racist, and heteronormative, the government led by Narendra Modi incorporates populism, nationalism, authoritarianism, and majoritarianism, while the grassroots cadre of millions of Hindu nationalists weaponize religion and politics to incite the Hindu majority. Hindu cultural nationalism sanctifies India as intrinsically Hindu and marks the non-Hindu as its adversary. Race and nation are made synonymous as Hindus, the formerly colonized, now governing elite, are depicted as the national race and authentic citizens. The advance of aggressive majoritarianism has correspondingly impacted Kashmir. Conditions on the ground in Kashmir are in a state of emergency. They have been so for decades. It is a place of no rights, shackled in concertina wire, suffocating in a state of interminable lockdown. Kashmiris live in a context akin to collective internment. Every neighborhood is impaired and each life has been impacted. Kashmiris, among whom Muslims are in a majority and their allies, have been repeatedly depicted as enemies of India and as potential agents of terror. On August 5, 2019, Kashmir's autonomy, partial autonomy rather, was revoked by the government of India, nullifying Article 370 and revoking Article 35A of the Indian Constitution, as tens of thousands of additional troops were reportedly deployed. In a parallel, between August and December of the same year, prejudicial citizenship laws akin to the Nuremberg laws instituted in September 1935 in Nazi Germany were configured for implementation across India. These laws privilege Hindus in defining citizenship and place the rights and protections of religious minorities at grave risk, particularly targeting Muslims. Following August 5th, Kashmir witnessed the reported torture of children, the elderly, and women, sexualized violence, illegal and mass detentions, house arrests of political leaders, curtailment of freedom of speech, movement, and dissent, falsification of social facts by the state, closure of sacred spaces. People were afraid to approach the courts lest the extra-legal detention be converted into formal detention. The impact on Kashmir's political economy was devastating, leading to a loss of reportedly $2.4 billion. In response to chronic oppression, Kashmiri civil society continued to take to the streets in large numbers. The protests bore expression to profound grief, rage, fatigue, heartbreak, resilience, and always resistance. The invalidation of Article 370 destroyed the very constitutional safeguard that could make the nullification of Article 370 contra legem, against the law, and made the subsequent actions of the Indian state possible. Counter-memory. The social and political breakage of Kashmir has its genesis in history. The unchecked spread of majoritarianism in India through the decades during which Hindu nationalists were not elected in office created political and legal contexts whereby the dismantling of Kashmir can now occupy center stage. The Indian Constitution, adopted in 1949, extended special status to Jammu and Kashmir through Article 370. Yet shortly after the assumption of the Constitution, India's government began to unilaterally modify its principles. Presidential orders were used to expand the mandate of most Indian laws and institutions to Kashmir, extending the will of the Indian Republic to subsume Kashmir's self-governance. Alongside, the Indian state renounced its commitment to establishing a plebiscite, despite promising to do so in domestic and international contexts in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Kashmir commenced an armed insurgency or armed struggle in 1989. During this period, local and cross-border militancy received support from Pakistan. By the Indian state's own records, armed militancy linked to foreign groups reportedly abated by 2004. And by 2006, a local and non-violent movement had ensued. The actions of the military, paramilitary, and police in Kashmir as they inflict terror on the local population are dispersed through extrajudicial means and those authorized by law. Impunity laws are enforced for militarized governance and extend immunity to one of the largest military forces in the world for human rights abuses, as exemplified by the Armed Forces Special Powers Act of 1990, the Jammu Kashmir Disturbed Areas Act, also of 1990, and the public, ironically named, Safety Act of 1978. Since 1989, Indian state forces have reportedly carried out extrajudicial executions targeting and killing Kashmiri civilians for unproven offenses, as well as enforced disappearances, gendered and sexualized violence, displacement, torture, repression of social movements, and the burial of civilians in unknown, unmarked, and mass graves. The collapse of the non-military political economy has compounded class and gender inequities. Non-governmental sources estimate approximately 100,000 people have died and more than 800,000 have been involuntarily disappeared. A large number of minority Hindu pundits have been displaced as well. Unrelenting militaristic and legal hostility to social dissent has targeted Kashmiri civilians, journalists, laborers, lawyers, academics, health professionals, students, and their allies. Kashmir's population lives with recurrent psychosocial trauma and with a very high rate of suicidal behaviors. Violence against civilian men has expanded spaces for enacting violence against women. Women have been forced to disproportionately assume the task of caregiving to disintegrated families and undertake the work as well of seeking justice following disappearances and deaths. Gendered and sexualized violence inevitably marks Kashmir. Sexualized violence as acts of power, torture, and weapons in war, and undeclared war, has had a long and complex history across colonialism and in post-coloniality. The body is signified as cultural property and rape as deliverance of justice enacted to punish the woman. Through targeting the individual, sexualized violence targets the political and cultural identity of subjugated groups. Nationalist violence, therefore, combines both militarization, heteronormativity, and patriarchy. The discourse of nation building equates hypermasculinization with decolonization. India's military prowess dictates the sexual domestication of Kashmiri Muslim women. Women's resistance has been profoundly shaped by the Indian state's targeting of Kashmiri Muslim men. Kashmiri women's participation in cultural and economic life and their refusal to be made docile anger those who seek their submission, such as Indian soldiers, themselves patriotic bodies configured as artillery, who are made to consign terror on Kashmir. Unknown and unmarked graves. Between 2006 and 2009, my colleagues and I investigated unknown, unmarked, and mass graves in Kashmir. In December 2009, the International People's Tribunal on Human Rights and Justice that we had convened released its report, Buried Evidence, which is available online for you to download free of cost. And we had documented 2,700 unknown graves containing more than 2,943 bodies spanning 55 villages across the districts of Bandipora, Baramulla, and Kupwara. The unknown graves are a vital component of the historiographic record. They are repositories of counter-memory, materiality, and information, and hold indispensable knowledge. The graves function as repositories of culture, kin, and community that have been devastated and destroyed. The graves are markers of an inheritance, and the bodies bear evidence to bigotry, violence, and contestation. Within the 2,700 graves, I won't get into the details. These are available in the report, but what I want to say is this. Records were available for only 49 bodies, and all of them had been counted or accounted for as militants of foreign insurgents by the Indian state. However, we found that 41 bodies were that of local civilians, 1 of a local militant, and 7 were unidentified, and none were foreign insurgents. 47 were all killed in fake encounters. The unknown graves link the issue of enforced disappearance, gendered and sexualized violence, and torture with extrajudicial execution. Extrajudicial execution is a present-day form of lynching in Kashmir. State forces are tantamount to the mob that targets and kills Kashmiri, predominantly Muslim men for alleged offenses. The graves evidence the alignment of national security with routine violence and the spectacular brutality of an undeclared war to enable drastic impunity within and outside the law. The findings of buried evidence compelled international attention. The matter of the graves was taken up by the government of Jammu and Kashmir, the Indian Parliament, United Kingdom Parliament, European Parliament, Office of the United Nations High Commission for Human Rights, and other international bodies. Atta Muhammad, I consider him a mentor, who died in 2016, was the gravedigger and caretaker of unknown graves at Chehal in Baramulla district in Kashmir. He said to me in 2011, "We live among these graves. People in Kashmir fear that they could be put in such a grave. Survival in Kashmir means learning to live with death." The graveyard in Chehal is filled with loose gravel adjacent to a high school for boys. Mr. Mohammed stated that people who are forced to bury the dead in unmarked graves live with prolonged psychosocial and physical health impacts. For many, who live proximate to the grave, their dreams are animated by fear and daily life is inhabited with nervousness and unease. Atta Muhammad said, "I have been terrorized by this task that was forced upon me. My nights are tormented and I cannot sleep. The bodies and graves reappear in my dreams. My heart is weak from this labor. I have tried to remember all this, the sound of the earth as I covered the graves, bodies and faces that were mutilated, mothers who would never find their sons. My memory is my obligation. My memory is my contribution. I am tired. I'm so very tired." In July 2011, the Jammu and Kashmir State Human Rights Commission, a governmental body, corroborated the findings of our report, Buried Evidence, leading to the first formal acknowledgement of the existence of these graves by an institution of the Indian state. The SHRC, State Human Rights Commission's actions were in alignment with the recommendations made by us. Though its power was severely limited, the SHRC took steps toward accountability and victim compensation in Kashmir. The state, however, sought to politicize the issue on the basis of religion, misrepresenting that Kashmiri Muslims would demur the exhumation of graves for DNA testing, which we had requested. The SHRC was an appellate body with limited powers, one of few state institutions that victims and survivors of rights violations could access. However, it must not be presumed that individuals who had approached that body did not understand themselves to be living under occupation or desire a political solution, because many of them did and do. In September 2011, my colleagues and I made a second submission to SHRC regarding the existence of unknown graves in 2 additional districts, totaling 3,800. The SHRC itself was disbanded by New Delhi in October 2019 with cases pending before it. As of August 2022, an equivalent body has not been established in Kashmir. Postscript. By March 2020, the advent of COVID-19, state forces were given extended powers during the health emergency. The Indian government removed certain legal barriers to permanent residency for non-Kashmiris in Kashmir to potentially reconstitute its demographic makeup and render Muslims a minority. These changes ignited across Kashmir concerns of demographic flooding of the region and land grab by non-Kashmiris. For proponents of Kashmiri self-determination, this was especially damaging. Demographic reconstruction stands to diminish the integrity of Kashmiris as a people. It imperils their rights to place and language, endangers their claims to internal self-determination and to external self-determination from alien exploitation and subjugation. The Indian state continues to position itself as righteous protectors of the national domain and Kashmiris as impostors on their land. The reconstitution of domicile laws may subdue the appearance of political conflict in Kashmir by rearranging facts on the ground. The law is used to suspend a binding contract between people and the state and to govern without consent and seek to make India's rule over Kashmir permanent and absolute. While suppressing while suppressing people's movements for dissent, freedom, justice, and accountability. By October 2021, following the reported militancy-related killings of Kashmiri Pandits, 4 of them, and a Kashmiri Muslim, the Narendra Modi government sought to reposition official discourse, warning that present-day militancy levels in Kashmir were analogous to 1990s and reinscribing yet again the language of terror. Power. How many minutes do I have? Perfect, thank you. Thank you. Power. Narrating a genealogy of Kashmir's present locates discourses and events in relations and corollaries of power. The relations of power that are attached to institutions and cultural practices and elucidate truth effects. To discern the effect of truth is to contend with violence as a category of analysis. Violence, as a category of analysis, reveals the distance and continuity between routine and spectacular events. Violence as a category of analysis presences the way in which violence drives decision and response and constitutes lives, community, place, politics, and gender in Kashmir. A project in counter-memory in Kashmir requires a scrutiny of the networks of violence that constitute state and nation. The execution of violence and death continues to exist on the borderline of that which is socially and juridically sanctioned. The knowledge and record of the deployment of death as a form of governance exists on the edge of legality. Life under militarization undermines a people's capacity to intervene in regularized and intimate impairments. Subjugation also requires the complicity of Kashmiris and forms a collaborator class whose actions and allegiances are complex. Present-day conditions on the ground in Kashmir have led to increasing concern within local civil society, international institutions regarding the preservation of the unmarked and unknown graves and of the materials relevant to the issue. The unknown and unmarked graves of Kashmir are living monuments, ever present like the walls of an internment camp for the prisoner within. The graves are repositories of heritage of extraordinary importance to individual and collective life and to the hope of justice for millions of Kashmiris. They attest to what is lost, what is wrong, and symbolic of affliction, resistance, and mourning. The narrative of a mother who sleepwalks to the unmarked grave of her son, as told to me by her family, chronicles her attempts to resuscitate his body day after day after day after day, year after year. It is dangerous to speak of the graves or to seek justice. The graves delimit the space of bare life, a life outside the impact of the graves, a life of rights that then becomes impossible. The alignment of national security with aggressive majoritarianism in India prohibits reflection on why Kashmiris resist. Such reflection is presented as seditious. Kashmiris are apprehensive that recent events could compel another armed uprising in an already volatile and nuclear region. They fear genocidal intent on the part of the Indian state and in cultural and perhaps physical form. In this new Kashmir, the ground has cracked open, a Kashmiri woman said to me after events of August 2019. It feels like massive prison gates have clamped shut around our Kashmir, our neighborhood, and my heart. We can't breathe. Last segment, reprisal. Orders to unnerve the leadership of our tribunal by the Government of India's Intelligence and Security Administration appear to have reportedly been generated at the highest levels. My colleagues in Kashmir have long experienced injustices for their extraordinary work as human rights defenders. Pervez Imroz, a noted human rights lawyer and my dear friend, has survived 3 assassination attempts, the first from militants. Others have been intimidated and threatened. A public intellectual from India, Gautam Navlaka, who has worked on Kashmir, has been in state custody since April 2020. I have been repeatedly threatened with death and rape by Hindu nationalists electronically and targeted physically by a mob on one occasion in India, and numerous attempts have been made to impede my work. My life partner has been deported from India. State institutions in Kashmir have sought to bring charges against me related to writing to incite crimes against the state. In October 2019, prior to testifying to the US House of Congress at its first hearing focused on Kashmir, it was communicated to me that by doing so, I could risk my citizenship. I'm a permanent resident of the United States and a citizen of India. The human rights defender Khurram Pervez has had to undergo the amputation of his leg following a landmine incident in 2004. He was targeted for his work on human rights issues and eventually incarcerated for 76 days in 2016. In October 2020, Indian authorities raided civil society groups in Kashmir, reportedly labeling journalists and certain journalists and activists as terrorists. Since November 2021, Khurram Pervez has been in the custody of the state on charges linked to criminal conspiracy and terror. The state of exception makes the anomalous routine in Kashmir. Majoritarian mobilizations infuse the body politic with illiberal agency, scripting repressive government, vigilantism, and political violence as inevitable. The politicization of religion and the racialization of Muslims target difference as anti-national, repositioning India's already conflicted democracy. Such assertions and actions reinforce unequal relations of power between the dominant and subaltern and enforce violence and assimilation on the latter. The BJP's furtherance of forms of coloniality in Kashmir, settler, legal, political, and others, as well seeks to actualize long-standing promises to unify India. Through the protracted conflict, bits of present history interconnect myriad events and realities and the overwhelming experience of massified violence, securitization, social and actual death. And these have scarred individual and collective life across generations. The 4 phases of Indian rule in Kashmir, 1949 through 89, 1990 through 2002, 2004, 2019, and since August 2019, have progressively heightened the precarity of life. The deployment of brutality and the evisceration of entitlements exist on the edge of legality and threaten the erasure of a people. These conditions render, and I again want to underscore, the life of rights impossible. As I speak to you today, I'm reminded that long ago, Khurram Pervez had asked me, "What would make you not return to Kashmir? How do we know you will keep coming back?" Much has happened since. I'm reminded of my father's words, broken yet resilient, in Narkeldanga and Rajapasar in Kolkata, in 1971. I learned from him, my grandmother's mother, aunts, and an extended circle of women who grew me, that requisite return to things that matter are fraught and uneasy. We attempt that nonetheless, in literal and figurative capacity. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I started crying as well. We have a few minutes for a question or comments. So if anyone has some, please come up to the floor. There's a microphone here.
Thank you. I think we're all left speechless and angered and moved, which I wanted to ask you more about the unmarked graves. I work in Mexico, We have more than 100,000 disappeared. There are many families and civil society organizations who don't think or want any kind of justice from the state, and the justice they have is exhuming themselves, searching themselves for their disappeared. And as far as I understood from you, these are people who are murdered, who are then interred by their families in secret, if I'm right. So could you tell us a little more of the story of the unmarked graves, please? And thank you.
Thank you so much. I had the privilege of meeting. There was the second, I believe, International Congress on Psychosocial Restitution in Bogota in 2010. And I had the privilege of meeting some extraordinary individuals from Mexico who were seeking justice at that gathering. Yes, you are right. Well, two things. One is we don't know who is buried in the graves, right, by and large. But of the ones that have been exhumed, we do know that disproportionately, for example, 47 of 49 that we were able to see records for, have been classified by the Indian state as foreign insurgents and terrorists, but in fact, indeed, are civilians. And one of the extraordinary things that I witnessed when I was there, we were investigating the graves, is that so if someone is killed in a certain area in north of Kashmir, their body might actually end up buried in South Kashmir. So it becomes really difficult for the family to track. And what often gravediggers who are forced into this task will do is look for signs of brutality or the clothes, the color of the clothes that they were wearing. They will put up these signifiers or through the grapevine circulate that information so that next of kin are able to hear and feel that, oh yes, that's someone of mine. And there was a person who came, whose this clip I had shown to the European Parliament, so it is available online. If you Google unmarked graves, Kashmir, my name, or something like that, it'll come up. So he had come with us to one of the graves, as he said, to show us where his brother is resting. And it took, when he first found out that his brother was in an unmarked grave, he wanted to petition the state to place a headstone. He didn't want to move the body, he just wanted to place a headstone. But to get permission to go to that grave, which is technically on public lands, required months, required mortgaging their home for collateral, required that his father was incarcerated and had to offer a bribe, and that he was brutalized also in prison. So the challenges are extraordinary. And the difference between an ongoing conflict and one that has ceased is that after secession, there are bodies that we might appeal to, and that the state itself commits to whatever extent to aid in this investigation, and independent investigations can take place. But ours was sort of a secret operation, if you will, and of a ragtag body of a few, lawyers, academics, etc. It was literally a body of like 5 people. And the Indian state, the commitment has been, and of the military, paramilitary, and police deployed in Kashmir, the commitment has been from the highest levels to do 2 things: to have the graves be an open space, young children going to school, looking at them every day, walking through a graveyard, going back and forth, seeing graves, seeing bodies being brought to these graves and interred. So the psychosocial impact that is repressive on the community, and at the same time, the sanction that we not speak of it outside. And that's sort of the dual effect that the state seeks to produce. And the maximum number of graves, as I understand, have taken place, or the placement of bodies in graves have taken place between 1990 and about 2004 or 5. And since then, they've been, relatively few, but also we have not investigated them. And often the bodies have been placed in individual graves, but that's only because the bodies are handed to people who try to honor Islamic rights and place the bodies in individual graves. But the intent of massified graves, and there are some graves where they have, more than 2 bodies, but the intent of sort of massified burial is quite complete across Kashmir. Thank you so much. Yes.
Okay, so we actually have a few more minutes. So 2 more questions.
And maybe I'll listen to them, then respond. That's
yes,
better.
that's a good idea. So if you both can come
Take
here.
notes. And there was another hand. You had
Thank you so much for this evocative and provoking lecture.
I'll keep it very brief. Thank you so much for that amazing presentation. I'm having some trouble because I'm enraged, as well as feeling some other things. I think my question is kind of having in synergy with some of the issues that Asif was just raising. In the larger context of what's happening in India at the moment, a number of commentators, there's a kind of section of Indian civil society that is calling the present moment India's second emergency, referring to India's first emergency from 1975 to 1977, when India was essentially under martial law. The constitution was suspended in the wake of an election that then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi had lost. So there are some who argue that saying that there is a second emergency happening in India discounts the fact that in places like Kashmir or places where AFSPA has been essentially the rule of law, there has never not been an emergency. And I wonder if you would comment on the utility of that debate and where you might stand in that question.
Thank you so much for your talk. It's deeply moving, and yeah, it's hard to actually ask a question. But following on from what Swati said, in terms of there has always been an emergency in Kashmir, and thinking about it as something right from Indian independence, and that there's been, all Indian states and all Indian governments have had a role to play in disappearances, and of course, what is interesting, and not interesting, but of course shocking and terrifying, is how then the current government seems to go beyond any of those other governments. And I was wondering whether could we also talk about perhaps a wider geopolitics in play, in terms of how that coalesces with the increasing racialization of Muslims, but it's also about how Pakistan is being how that's viewed, and how the relationship between India and Pakistan, because that is also the sad fact of being, of belonging in a kind of liminal context where you're forever, like we see with sort of Syria and Afghanistan and Ukraine and, these kind of contexts, that, there has to be some broader global accountability in that kind of context as well. And so I just was wanting to understand, that, and perhaps also how you yourself got involved in this. But I know that's a broader question, but thanks.
Thank you so much. May I respond?
Yes, please.
Thank you. How much time do I have?
So we decided that you have 5 minutes, and then we won't have a break. We go directly to the next part of the program. So please, 5 minutes, if that's possible.
Perfect. Thank you. So let me try. Not going to be easy, and we can maybe have more conversation later. So and I will just because yeah. So I'm going to do this without mentioning names. Yes. I think that what, for example, when we presented the findings on the graves, our assertion was not, or our statement was not that these are human rights violations, but that these are mass crimes that have taken place during a context of declared, undeclared, high intensity, low intensity war. And I think that there are various things we're looking at here: conflict, self-determination, occupation, forms of colonialism. And I marked all of them in my talk, but obviously not sufficiently, or not in depth, as well as the use of rights violations, not just human rights, but rights violations, and the use of epical violence and mass crimes to govern. So I think we need to understand that these are technologies of governance, and that to have a conversation that is not today, whatever that conversation needs to be, a prescription should not really ensue from someone such as myself. I think Kashmiris have to be seen as primary stakeholders in this conversation. And I think that one must listen and hear, as someone of Hindu descent from India, I think I have seen, colleagues in the United States who are of, I don't know what one means by saying white descent, because there's so much erasure and loss in just that term, the construction of that term. But I've seen white allies undertake this work in the United States, for example. And I think that in India, both with respect to Kashmir, with respect to minority communities, with respect to caste oppression, Adivasis, and gender and sexuality, there's a lot of listening that we have to do. And I know that it's not flat privilege and marginality. I understand that, obviously. But I think that with respect to Kashmir, if we want to move anywhere else that is not today, we will have to confront what is really horrible about ourselves. I'm talking about people of dominant descent in India. I think that we're going to have to look at sort of the repeated partitions and the traumas ensued through them. I think we're going to have to look at the role of the Indian state with its disproportionate power in South Asia. All states have accountability, obviously, but the Indian state certainly has disproportionate power and therefore disproportionate responsibility. I think to shift beyond looking at states to looking at peoples and cultures and regions, and to look at what is not working, why it is not working, and that we cannot put a Band-Aid on this and call that peace. Some of the most, a colleague had written, a feminist commentator had written long time ago that peace is some of the most violent times in South Asia. So I just wanted to say that, and I think that there, your question linking coloniality, decoloniality, self-determination will require agentizing unforgetting. And it's through that agentization of unforgetting that we can memory our struggles, our hopes, our acknowledgements, our guarantee to non-repetition, our possibility for justice. Okay, I will pause here. This was a hodgepodge of an answer. In the context of larger issues, second emergency, I don't believe this is a second emergency. I think we're way, way past second emergency. I think there was the first emergency, and then there was phases of second emergency throughout. You know, this is a full-blown something else. The emergence akin to what we have witnessed globally in various, sort of illiberal, authoritarian regime, a government, a party, and its popular grassroots cadre who draw inspiration from Nazi Germany, right? That's who is in power today. So let's call it what it is. This is not a second emergency. This is not something we can overturn with the law, or we can overturn by going to courts or having a fair-minded judge. This is also popularly elected government, which raises another issue for us. Who are we? Veena Das once said that, after partition, people were born sort of simultaneously born as monsters. Who I'm not saying this well, but something like that she'd alluded to. So who are we that we have consecrated this government in India that now governs us? So I think, no, it is not a second emergency. And especially with respect to Kashmir, and also with respect in India with Assam, for example, and what has been ongoing there with respect to citizenship, the revocation of citizenship rights, rendering stateless citizens. Yes. Millions of them, yes. Then, and I want to talk about Uttar Pradesh and Yogi Adityanath, but I'll just mark that and pause, and maybe that's a later conversation. Last one very quickly. There has always been an emergency in Kashmir, yes. When people are governed without their consent, it is to be deemed a state of emergency. Governance without consent is to commence an emergency for a people. So yes. Wider geopolitics, I think that the international community needs to not be so short-term in its calculation with respect to India. Because I think the calculation is a panic of markets, of resources, and an Orientalist understanding of what India is. That somehow a refusal to let in what India has become. The India that we know and that the international community knows and loves, yes, of course it is there, but it is also simultaneously choking. So I think that Orientalization, one has to be deconstructive in relation to that. And whether it is the Quad, for example, a strategic defense, to ask states need to ask themselves, can India be a responsible security partner when its internal security is in the disarray that it is? So again, briefly, and I will pause. Thank you. Thank you.